Welcome to Industry Leaders, the only business show that travels around Australia to share the stories behind trusted brands, bringing you real, passionate people who are industry leaders. On this special limited edition, our most moving episode ever at Sydney's Children's Cancer Institute, where professors remember when a child with cancer was facing a certain death sentence, plus one parent's gripping story of helping other cancer sufferers and their families. You are now watching Industry Leaders.
The really amazing thing about Children's Cancer Institute is that we were founded by parents. Two dads who both had a child with leukemia way back in 1975.
We were living in a beautiful country town in Queensland, Childers, a sugarcane growing town, and life was good for us. But then our daughter Helen became seriously ill. And she was under a specialist doctor in Bundaberg. He suggested that we come to the Sydney Children's Hospital in Sydney. And it was about 48 years ago that Helen was diagnosed with leukemia.
In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a diagnosis of childhood cancer was virtually a death sentence. Almost every child who was diagnosed with cancer died. And at about in the mid-1970s, the survival rate for acute lymphoblastic leukemia had risen to about 50%. 1 in 2 children was surviving.
So acute lymphoblastic leukemia is the most common cancer that children get. There's a group of leukemias, and the acute form of it, which develops very quickly, is the most common cancer that children get.
And on the ward there, he met a guy called John Luff, whose son Robbie was 3 years old and had been diagnosed with leukemia.
John and I met at the clinic, and we started talking about, and John kept saying all the time, "Jack, we've really got," sorry. He'd say, "Jack, we really need to do something to help these doctors help our children." And he'd say it over and over again.
And all those children were getting the same kind of chemotherapy. And in those days, it was still very experimental to be giving children chemotherapy, and no one really knew which of these kids was going to survive and which would not.
The first chemotherapy was proven to work in children's leukemia. That work was conducted in the United States. Although at the time, the person who was pioneering that was actually told that what they were doing was morally wrong, that he was poisoning children because these were children that it was believed they would all die of cancer, and why would you torture them with drugs?
And while those dads were there, trying to get their kids through this terrible time in their lives, they started to talk about the need for research. They started to talk about the fact that in Australia we actually had no research dedicated to children with cancer. As it happened, they were both members of the Apex Foundation.
John was a member of the Apex Club of Wollongong, and I just happened to be past president of the Apex Club of Childers.
They went back to their clubs, in particular the club in Wollongong, which is where John Luff was from, and they talked about the need to raise funds because they had this vision.
Anyhow, at that time, an agency called the John Singleton Advertising Agency decided to take us on board at no cost.
John Singleton, who was a very well-known advertising guru in Australia, and they told their story. And he said, "Okay, yep, I can help you. What you need is a campaign, you need a logo, and what we're going to do is we're going to call this campaign Some Kids Make It, Some Kids Don't, Help a Kid Make It." And so that became the name of the Apex Foundation campaign.
But one of the most other amazing things that happened in 1976 was we came from the country, right? We travelled 1,000 kilometres to the city. Fortunately, we we were able to stay near the hospital and stay the 3 years. There were dozens and dozens of country families who had children dying from leukemia and cancer, who had nowhere to stay, and because of the cost of accommodation and the transport and all of the other huge costs, these country families couldn't afford. So a number of country families made the decision. Their child probably wasn't going to survive anyhow, but they made the decision to take the child home to die. On one of my flights home to Childers, and this fellow sat down beside me, and he said, "Hi." He said, "My name's Ralph Hunt. Do you want to have a chat?" So I told him on that flight all about it. Guess what? He became the Federal Minister for Health. And I got a phone call in February of 1976. It was from Canberra, and it was Ralph Hunt on the line. And he said, "Jack, I want you to know today that I'm having a bill passed through Parliament that's going to subsidise all of the travel and the accommodation of every child that's sick, living in a country area of Australia that's outside 100 kilometres from the city." Little did we know at the time that this was going to facilitate the opening of Ronald McDonald houses across Australia.
Still to come on Industry Leaders, an Apex fundraiser that led to the first research unit for Children's Cancer Institute, and the true story of one of the children who did make it to become a teacher.
There was a member of the Wollongong Apex Club, the late Doug Maloof, and he's famous worldwide. And Doug Maloof put this training book together.
And so they trained themselves in public speaking, and every Friday night they went to Sydney Airport and they travelled all around Australia each weekend presenting to Apex clubs to get them on board with the campaign.
And we convinced the regional convention to raise these funds to build a research centre. And then we went to the national convention. Sorry. Then we went to the Apex National Convention on the Gold Coast. And just prior to the convention, John's son, Robbie, passed away. He died. And our little girl, Helen, was continuing to do well.
Helen Cassis did make it, and Helen Cassis today is a teacher. She's 54 years old and she's in relatively good health.
And at the end of the year of the fundraising campaign, John and all the team at Wollongong had raised a total of $1.3 million. We could not believe it.
They had raised $1.3 million, which is sort of the equivalent of about $8 million today. And those are the funds that opened up our first laboratories at the back of Sydney Children's Hospital in 1984.
And we actually constructed the first stage, which we call the Apex Centre. The first director of the research centre, a person named Bernard Stewart. And with him, he brought 3 young budding scientists. Those scientists were Michelle Haber, Murray Norris, and Maria Cavallaris. And Bernard and these 3 scientists started to lay the foundation for how they were going to change forever our understanding of the treatment of leukemia and cancer in children.
And so that was really the beginning of how the Institute first came about. And if you talk to any one of those early parents that got involved with making the Institute happen, they will tell you that the funds came from the community. So there were a lot of Saturday Fete, where Jack Cassis would be running the chocolate wheel to try and raise money. not only to get the doors opened, but to keep the institute going.
You know, the passion for me, I joined the institute as the inaugural PhD student back before it was an institute at all, just a very small centre. And I think, you know, meeting the parents of children with cancer, seeing their dedication and motivation and wanting to actually achieve better outcomes for their kids, it's something that is terribly motivating for me as a person. And I remember those early days. It used to be getting together with them, holding fates, running chocolate wheels, selling tickets, raising money to help drive the research that would eventually turn into Children's Cancer Institute. And you know, we went from a staff of 4 researchers through to today where we have over 350 staff in our institute.
So in the early days of children's cancer, so when we first started the institute, children were treated with very high dose chemotherapy. Many children got very sick and died from their disease. Now we're seeing some major improvements and changes in the way we're starting to address children's cancer.
So for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, by the time I started work at the institute, about 3/4 of these children were surviving, but 1/4 of them were relapsing when they were given standard therapy.
Although in treating these children you could get the majority of them into remission, in other words, no clinical signs of their disease at all, nevertheless a proportion of them, back in those days it was 1 in every 4 children, were going on to relapse, and that relapse may be some years afterwards.
We didn't know which children were going to relapse, and yet we wanted to know that. These old drugs would attack the cancer cell, but also the normal cells, and leave the child with significant defects. So we didn't want to treat every child with these high doses of drugs. We wanted to know which ones to target.
That was the reason that we then were minimum residual disease, in order to have a very sensitive technique that can pick up these very small numbers of leukemia cells.
Michelle Murray and I were the first to develop a test called minimal residual disease testing. That back when we started working on this nearly 30 years ago, many of these children were relapsing and dying of their cancer.
So we began a project to use molecular genetic testing that could measure the presence of 1 leukemic cell in 1 million normal cells in a child's bone marrow after the first 5 weeks or 12 weeks of treatment.
That will enable us to find those children who are not responding to the treatments that we're giving them well enough, and to change their treatment really early on.
And so we conducted an international clinical trial here at the Institute and in partnership with the clinicians at Sydney Children's Hospital.
It was a 10-year clinical trial. It enrolled over 650 children in Australia with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And at the start of the trial, the survival rates for those children who had high-risk disease, the children who were probably likely to go on and relapse, their survival rates were around 35%. And by the end of the trial, those children with this high-risk disease, their survival rate now was up over 70%.
We doubled the survival rate. So at the end of that study, there were more than 50 children alive who otherwise would not have been without our tests that we'd developed.
Coming up on Industry Leaders, more empowering stories from Children's Cancer Institute that's given its patients purpose and a chance to not only survive but thrive, leading to the Zero Childhood Cancer Program with remarkable results.
When I was 13, my mum kind of got sick of me being unwell. It was almost like I was faking, because one second I'd be okay and then the next day I wasn't. So we went to the GP who ran some blood tests, and then when my GP walked in, he had tears in his eyes, and he looked at me and said that I had leukemia, and I explained that it was a blood cancer but that we needed to go straight to the Children's Hospital at Westmead for further testing. And I was essentially allergic to that chemo. Treatment became a little bit more tricky and different to what the standard protocol would be. So aside from chemotherapy and steroids, I also had radiation to my head and spine to stop the cancer from spreading. And another difficult thing has been I'm also going through IVF. So my cancer and my treatments have affected my fertility, and one thing that's never changed is I always wanted to be a mum. And so, pushing through, and I'm so lucky to be alive. I'm so lucky that even with my late effects, things could be so much worse. I support the Children's Cancer Institute because selfishly, it's given me a purpose. I am able to give back. I've met incredible families. The warrior families are like everything to me. They give me hope, they push me through. I've had the experience of being able to share my story and connect with other people. Being able to raise money for research into treatments is something that I'm really passionate about. I want people to not only survive cancer, but I want them to be able to thrive post-treatment and post this whole journey.
We thought, what if we do this not just for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, but for every child's cancer? And so we worked with the clinicians. Our scientists here at Children's Cancer Institute worked with the clinicians at the Kids Cancer Centre at Sydney Children's Hospital to develop what has become Australia's national child cancer precision medicine. We call it Zero Childhood Cancer.
The Institute has been involved in the Zero Childhood Cancer program, which is being able to take the children's tumour material and their normal cells as well, and then sequencing the entire DNA from and RNA from those cells, and then being able to kind of pinpoint the genetic changes in a cancer cell that have gone on to be the driver of that particular cancer.
So the precision is also sort of synonymous with the word individualisation. So this is taking the patient's own cancer cell to grow the cancer cells in the lab and set them against drugs that may or may not work against those cells, and then giving that information back to the treating oncologist, and they then choose with the families whether they want to use those drugs.
Instead of treating a child with a chemical cocktail that is attacking broadly any dividing cells, rapidly proliferating cells, here you're actually targeting the specific genetic driver. And now that's been going since 2015, and there have been some remarkable results there on that.
The first demonstration of the power of precision medicine was a little child called Ellie. She was 11 months old. She was in intensive care in Sydney Children's Hospital with a tumour the size of a football in her chest. She was on intensive care. She was on life support because the tumour was so big that it was compressing her lungs and her ability to breathe. She'd had chemotherapy, she hadn't responded, and in the earliest days of the Zero Childhood Cancer program, we were able to do comprehensive genetic profiling of Ellie's cancer. We were able to find and source the drug that could target that specific genetic change. It was a syrup, it wasn't even intravenous chemotherapy with all its associated side effects. Within days, Ellie's condition improved, the tumour started shrinking, she came off life support, she came out of intensive care, and within weeks she was home. Years later, Ellie is now alive and well and at school without side effects, and this is a child who would otherwise have died. The precision medicine program is being rolled out for every child in the country with cancer, not just the high-risk ones, but everyone. And by the end of 2023, starting with all the Australian children with brain tumours, and then for every different type of cancer, by the end of this year, precision medicine will be available to every child in this country with cancer.
This is Industry Leaders. Still ahead, a brighter future for children with DIPG cancer, thanks to Levi's project at Children's Cancer Institute. Help a child beat cancer. Go to ccia.org.au.
So Levi was a gorgeous kid. He was a typical child. He loved his friends and his family. When he was diagnosed, he was 7 years old. We had to go for a biopsy on his brain. We didn't have to, we chose to. When we went into an oncologist's office 2 weeks later, we were told that his official diagnosis was DIPG. I remember vividly that room and everything about that day and that moment. Levi was out in the waiting room and we were told that he was going to die within 12 months, and he was sitting there, an outwardly healthy child. We stayed at Bear Cottage with Levi in the week before he died. Someone said to me the other night, they said, if we fund the research and cure these children, we won't need a place like Bear Cottage. At Levi's funeral, we asked for donations to Professor David Ziegler, who is head of the Brain Tumours Group at Children's Cancer Institute. We asked for donations to his research, and our friends and family gave over $60,000 to research, and that was the start of our philanthropy. And months after that, we launched Levi's project in partnership with the Institute, and it's been going now for nearly 4 years. And we've raised $4 million so far, which is incredible to even say those words. That was something beyond our wildest dreams. I remember when we started, we thought we'd love to fund a research scholarship. We've just contributed $600,000 to a CAR T cell therapy trial called Levi's Catch. And we know we're part of making a change for other kids with DIPG.
The community support that we have is absolutely critical in driving our ability to conduct world-leading research here at Children's Cancer Institute. Now, the survival rate is above 80% for all children with cancer. For some children's cancers, like acute lymphoblastic leukemia, it's now over 90%. But there are other children's cancers, like some of the worst type of brain cancers, where the survival rate is still 0. And for these children, and for all the other children who are still dying of cancer, this is the research that we need to do. A recent example last week, where we had some of the major supporters of our research, and a mother whose child had died of one of the most aggressive brain tumours, one of the ones where the survival rate is still 0, talked about how she has harnessed her network to raise the funds to help drive our research so that 3 new clinical trials for this terribly aggressive brain tumour, it's called DIPG, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, no known cures, but through community fundraising, her family and networks have raised the funds to drive our research into new clinical trials. We can have all the best scientists in the world, but without the funds to undertake the research, we will not be able to remain at the international forefront.
My hope is that they will walk into an oncologist's office and they are told that they have DIPG, that this is a cancer that we can treat, and this is how we're going to treat it.
We really appreciate any support that people can give us, whether that's through volunteering or through themselves donating or themselves fundraising. And the best thing to do is to go to our website, which is www.ccia.org.au, and go in there and see what events are coming up, see what activity is happening, and if there's something that would appeal to you. I've been lucky enough to work at this institute for 10 years. I have the best job in the world. I want to be out of a job. I want there to be no reason to raise more money or get this message out there, because not only here in Australia, but around the world, I can see a future where we can say to a parent of a child with cancer, okay, we've got the results. We're sorry to say your child has cancer, but that's okay. We know what we're going to do next, and we've got the treatment we need. He will survive, or she will survive.
Some kids make it, some kids don't. Help a kid make it. And right throughout that campaign, I know John would say, well, Jack, he said, our Robbie didn't make it. But your daughter Helen made it. Now, what a legacy, what a legacy young Robbie has left. And his father and his mother all those years ago. Robbie didn't make it, but I'll tell you what, they laid the foundation for the saving of the lives of thousands and thousands of children over the last 40 years. So Robbie's legacy lives on.
Join us next time on Industry Leaders when we invite you to be part of #IndustryLeadersTV Show.